If you drive at night, listen closely. These are the most chilling road stories ever told, and in some of them, people never came back. I'm the one who pulls these testimonies together. I'm the voice between you and the people who have lived the moments that make other drivers keep the radio on a little louder on lonely stretches of highway. Tonight, I'll read accounts from those who spend more time with asphalt and starless sky than they do with their own families. Long-haul drivers, lone travelers, a photographer who trusted the desert to be empty. These are listener-submitted memories, sometimes corroborated by news clippings, sometimes left as single, stubborn details. A child who vanished between the taillights. A stooped old man who says a thing and then is gone. Footprints that lead nowhere. I'll tell them straight, and I'll leave the questions where they belong, with you, listening over a late shift or an empty road. Before we dive in, if these stories pull at you, subscribe and tell us the city you're listening from in the comments. That's how we keep hearing more. The first story comes from a woman who sent a short, exact note. We were on our way to the hospital. Then we saw the boy. She asked that I not use her full name. I'll call her Anna. They left home after midnight because whoever's sick needed help that night. We all know the kind of urgency that will make you drive in a storm. The wipers kept time, not quite keeping up. Rain blurred the road into a silver smear. The highway lights were distant, like a line of stars pulled down to the earth. Her husband drove. Anna sat upright and watched the way the rain made the headlights look like a tunnel. They were maybe 20 minutes out of the city when something small flashed across the beams. A child. Not running in that comic book way where everything moves slow and cinematic. Just suddenly, there, a silhouette darting from the shoulder into the lane. A tiny figure with a backpack, the wet fabric clinging, legs moving like it was late and dangerous and necessary. The husband slammed the brakes. Tires shrieked. The car rocked forward. Water sprayed in sheets. Anna remembers the horn, but what she remembers most is the smell. Wet earth and something sweet like crushed grass, and the image of the child's shoes, small and bright even through the downpour. They stopped in the right lane, hazard lights blinking into the rain. The husband flung the door open, boots slipping on the asphalt, and ran toward where the child had crossed. Anna zipped her sweater around her and followed. The rain hit their faces hard. The world shrank to the circle of the car's light, and the puddles that flashed. There was no sign, no footprints in the slurry of water and road grid, nothing to mark that someone had fought across traffic at speed. Only a little smear on the shoulder where the gravel had been disturbed, but nothing like a child's prints disrupted into the passing lanes.
Neighbors' houses were too far away. No porch lights showed anyone watching. A truck that had passed moments before pulled over behind them, its driver asking if everything was okay, and they explained. The trucker nodded slowly. Not the nervous kind of nod, but the one that meant you had seen things before on that stretch and you didn't want to talk about them. He said he'd taken nights on this highway for 20 years. He didn't say much except to advise them to get back in the car and continue. While he kept his voice low, he told them to keep going. Weeks later, Anna said, she found a local paper buried under a stack of old bills. A bus had overturned near that stretch a few months before, a detail that hadn't been in the national feeds but had been shared on community groups. Late night, a line route, rain, a passenger list, and a headline that never lingered in the eyes of much of the country. The report used words like collision and several injuries, and in the quiet paragraph between legal statements, the list of victims. The timing matched close enough to keep a knot in her chest. Was the child a person still trying to make it across a road where a bus had gone off years or months earlier? Was it a fragment of memory, a nervous brain playing back images of tragedy during a storm? Was it a prank? Anna admits she considered all of it. What she could not explain was the clarity of the movement, the simple, terrible insistence of a small body crossing asphalt, and the way the world after that moment felt subtly out of joint, like the road had kept that motion in its grooves and was willing to show it to people who would notice. There are cautionary tales tied to those late hours. There are rules handed down in truck stops and between brothers the way recipes are passed along. A tilt of the head here, an unfinished sentence there. One of those rules came from a man who spent his life behind the wheel. If you see a kid in the road, don't chase. Keep driving. We don't stop between 3 and 4. It sounds cold until you hear the reason given with the kind of tired exhale that means the speaker has earned the right to be blunt. We'll get to that later. It threads through tonight's final story. For now, the rain and the boy were Anna's memory. A small, bright phantom that didn't come back for them, and a news clipping that, like a tear in the fabric of ordinary life, suggested there was more there than one nervous imagination. Maybe the child was real. Maybe the highway keeps echoing what happened on it. Either way, Anna and her husband kept their fingers white on the wheel for weeks after. They still take the longer route. There's a pattern in these stories. Someone on the road pauses, stretches out a hand meant to help, and the road answers with something that looks like a person but behaves in ways a living body does not. Our next account has that pattern, but with an added layer: repetition.
Families in trucking lanes share more than a job. They share a language of signs and warnings, and sometimes a face. My next listener sent voice notes, long, winding ones, about a thing he calls the family shadow. He grew up in a household where fathers and uncles were drivers. Names passed along in these stories recall towns you might find on a faded map: Durango, the winding road toward Mazatlan, the hairpin turns that make you respect your brakes. He opened with Uncle Beto, and the voice on the line softened in a way that made me think he was in the cab again, miles from anyone and only memory for company. Beto was a man who never married and loved his old truck like some people love houses. He drove routes that were mostly night, and he prized silence over the radio, said it kept him awake in the only honest way. On a stretch north of Durango, Beto pulled over one night to stretch, a habit his family knew well. The sky had settled to a kind of heavy dark that makes distance mean less and removes depth. That's when he saw the old man. He was described always the same: small stature, stooped as if he carried something on his shoulders, hat pulled low, coat too thin for the desert. He walked like someone moving through a wind that wasn't there, with hands loose at his sides. The first time Beto saw him, he walked the road's edge, not on the gravel, not on the shoulder, but somehow between the painted line and the darkness beside it. Beto, being Beto, called out. He hopped out and approached the figure slow, a reflex that drivers have from decades of offering help where Good Samaritans would applaud. The old man looked at him. That's what Beto always told the family. He looked like someone you'd recognize but couldn't place. His eyes were tired, not mean. He said, "You're too late. Death is near." The delivery was matter of fact, not a threat, a warning, scarcely more. When Beto blinked, the figure was gone. No footprints, no smudge of coat on the shoulder gravel, and Beto checked the ditch and the scrub like any man would when he'd been told a thing with such bluntness. About an hour down the road, Beto found a pickup in the ravine. The truck's paint was a wash of pale from the dust. It lay crumpled in a place no one had expected to be there. The rescue crew on scene said the driver hadn't made it out. The horse that had been tied to the back, someone later described it in a way that made the stories twist into each other, stood nearby, oddly quiet and wet, its coat dark with something that glistened in the flashlight beams. People who tell the tale now stop and lower their voices when they describe how it was alive but somehow marked, shaken maybe, or covered in mud, or some other darkened film. Beto swore he could still smell the animal's breath and hear the click of its hoofs if he closed his eyes. He swore, too, he remembered the old man's voice. Years later, another man in the family, Uncle Chava, told the same story about the same face. Chava was a cautious driver. He wouldn't have been one to invent chills for sport. His account came from a wet season traveling under a flat silver sky. He saw the old man near a rest stop, hands tucked like a man who doesn't want to bother you. And when Chava slowed to give him a lift, the old man said the same odd phrase: "Death is near." Chava stopped at the next curve and found the road blocked. A collision under a trailer, where a car, pressed like a folded thing, had been stopped or struck. There were no survivors in that small vehicle. Chava called it the worst smell of oil and rubber he'd ever known, and told the family he remembered the stoop of that old man as if it were his shadow. Here's the creep in that thread. Beto and Chava described the old man the same way. Not only the same clothes, hat low, coat, but the same tilt of head, the same way his mouth seemed to be making the words through a dry throat. Their brothers said the face looked a bit like the grandfather they had on old photographs, a man who'd been in and out of town decades earlier. The idea is almost too tidy, a family's collective grief turning a memory into a messenger, and yet multiple drivers from the same line, with no reason to lie to one another, reported the same interruption of road and silence. Some people offer a practical reading. If you drive long enough, you know where wrecks happen. A stooped old man on the shoulder could be real, or he could be a local who sometimes stands and watches the road. The phrase, "death is near," might be a warning against an unseen curve, a way of telling a driver to be careful. Others say the figure is the kind of thing a highway collects, an echo, a residue of people who died there. Still others, more superstitious, confess the old man is a kind of omen. If he appears, bring extra care or call someone. The family kept the story alive without deciding which explanation they preferred.
They clung to what felt practical, a driver's instinct to be careful when a place feels off. Beto's last call was different. He was on a long haul up the coast, the radio low. He sent a message to his nephew, the one who later told me the stories, saying he'd seen the old man again. This time, Beto talked about how the man had raised his hand a little, like asking to be helped. Beto said he would stop. He was done for the night. He wanted to make sure the old man was all right. He stepped out, called a hello, and when he reached the spot, there was no one. A local farmer told him he'd seen a horse loose by the road that morning. Beto laughed it off. People said he began to worry more about his own luck than he used to. He wrapped the steering wheel absurdly tight on the next leg, and the family noticed. I asked the nephew why the family kept the stories and the rule about warning people. He answered simply, "It's the way we pay attention."
You learn to listen to the road. That ear gives drivers a kind of cultural memory, a list of places not to stop, gestures to make, something to do with the way lonely lanes eat certainty. There's another layer to this subset of testimonies. Long-haul drivers often see strange lights and figures, horses where you don't expect them, people walking miles without a car in sight. Some of that is explained: poor visibility, fatigue, the way human minds try to make sense of odd shapes and motion. But the family stories are stubborn because two men saw the same thing years apart and used the same words. Whether that's coincidence, a prank, or a ghost that prefers the company of those who've loved one another enough to remember a face, it's the sort of story that stays with you when you file it away. After Beto's tales, the nephew told me about a truck stop where drivers traded not only stories but chores. Someone washed the wheels of a mate who'd been on the same run. Someone else fixed a taillight. People in the trade have tacit rules about calling in when a part of the road feels like a place that keeps secrets. Beto and Chava's family pass those secrets as warnings, their instructions disguised as story, because sometimes living depends on listening to the right voice. Between that and the desert, the tone changes. The road keeps emptying itself of people the further you go. That's when the voices grow louder. The third testimony I'll begin tonight comes from a man named Mike, a photographer who went out to Baja alone, looking for light and silence. Photographers tell me the desert undoes expectations. It can make a small thing look enormous. It can make time strange. Mike had traveled for work and for himself, a camera bag, a cooler, a plan to shoot the road at dawn. He liked being alone. The edge of the world was part of his method. On the second night, he began feeling ill, a dizziness that blurred his teeth and made the horizon bend. He pulled off at an outpost that looked abandoned in the dark, a rusted sign, a lone gasoline pump long since disconnected, a box of bottles rolling in the wind. He turned off the engine, climbed out, and shuffled toward a lean-to where people so often find refuge. The wind carried the thin, dry scent of creosote into the cab, and a lunar white spread flat over the sand. Mike felt foolish for going to sleep in a place like that. He said in his voice note that he'd taken the upshot. Fatigue was the least dangerous thing he could admit to. He sat with the engine idling and tried to steady himself. Then he heard them. Voices. Two of them, low and conversational, the kind you hear when people close a door behind them and feel safe. They came from somewhere outside the wash of the headlights. They were speaking Spanish, in a voice Mike couldn't fully place as male or female, more like air moving around a throat.
He remembers every single syllable, like a recording in slow playback. They said they'd wait here and that they'd watch. The words were ordinary and ordinary threatening, like two neighbors agreeing on a meeting place. Mike felt the hair on his arms stand up, not the prickly fear of a phantom, but the animal sense that he'd been noticed. He eased the car key into the ignition and drove away, breathing shallow and cursing the adrenaline at how loud his own heartbeat felt. When he stopped at the next pull-off and looked back, he expected to find footprints in the sand leading to the outpost, boots, scuff marks, the obvious human trace that would explain the voices. There were none, not a single print but his own. Mike walked the perimeter under a half moon, flashlight beam trembling, and the sand held only the path his tires had cut and the straight, lone line of his own tracks. No evidence of two people sitting on the porch or of voices, only the indents of his own boots. This is the moment where Mike hesitated, where he started collecting possible, rational causes against the word that made his throat go dry. Heat delirium can create dialogues. Exhaustion can manufacture people you can hear but not touch. He is a photographer. He is not given to fiction. He told me he considered that his brain might write scenes during the night to make solitude less empty. He considered that someone might have been hiding and had walked quietly away. He thought of a prank by local kids,
all sensible possibilities. Yet the memory of the syllables, "will wait here," stuck to his mouth like something sour. Years pass in other people's stories, while this one sits like a warning. Mike drove home early. He wiped his sweat-stained forehead against the towel he kept in the cab and told himself he would never sleep at that kind of outpost again. He also told a friend at a gallery about the incident and was met with the old response. Maybe it was heat stroke. Maybe it was a trick of the wind. The friend's voice was trying to be kind. And the thing that made Mike uneasy later was not that he had heard voices. It was that the voices said they'd wait, as if the outpost itself were a place where some presence resolved into someone who could watch. The sand refused to keep their proof. The desert had the polite cruelty to erase footsteps overnight. That's practical. Wind, tide, the angle of the sun. But for those moments when people describe seeing or hearing things, the desert's forgetting feels less comforting than it should. Mike's story stops for now at a single image, his own boots, sunk in the sand, and the knowledge that if something had sat there and spoken, the land had wiped the conversation clean. You can walk the shore of that memory and never find bones of proof. The absence feels like an accusation. We're about halfway through tonight's run, and the roads up ahead will become lonelier still.
I've sampled rain and a vanished child, an old man who appears to warn drivers and disappears, and a desert outpost that holds voices without owners. Each account keeps a breadcrumb of doubt with it. Each asks you to choose the explanation that comforts you most. Drivers pass down rules like prayers. Some are pragmatic. Check your mirrors, keep a distance, never accept rides from strangers on deserted stretches. Others sound like fragments of older superstitions dressed for the highway. Don't stop at certain bridges. Don't pick up children at 3 in the morning. If you've driven much, you know the list. The point isn't that the rules are universal truth. The point is they're practice. They're a way to give shape to danger. I won't be scolding anyone. These are testimonies, not commandments. But I will say this, calmly. People who spend long nights on the road learn to be suspicious of the quiet. It keeps them alive in more ways than one. That's the through line here. The road is not merely a surface to be crossed. It's a memory and a mouth. It holds what happens to people, and sometimes it offers those things back. Before the next story, a brief note. If you've been on the road and you have a memory that sits heavy in your chest, we want to hear it. Leave us an audio or a message at the usual spot. We're listening. I don't promise answers, but I do promise the stories will be told with the care they deserve. The next account begins to climb toward the kind of emptiness that makes you doubt the practical explanations. It comes from someone who has been on the move so long he stopped counting the nights. Carlos, a mason who drives smaller routes through the desert, and sometimes delivers to people who live where the map is a suggestion. He says he's not a credulous man, only someone with a memory that refused to be filed under coincidence. Carlos was passing a stretch south of Mazatlan, a lonely highway rimmed with scrub that shadows deeper at night. He was making time, thinking of the list he'd leave at home, when his headlights picked up a figure in the median, a small child, maybe 5 or 6, clutching something to his chest and looking lost. The boy was too close to the lane. The thought of him stepping into traffic made Carlos slam the brakes and pull off. Carlos remembers the skin of the boy's arm in his memory, thin and covered with dust, and the look that felt like age in a child's eyes. He tried to speak, offered water, gave a jacket. The boy didn't say much. When Carlos asked where the parents were, the child pointed behind him toward the span of the overpass, not at a house, not at a car, just toward the place where shadows squatted. The child asked for a ride, and here is where most of the stories stray into the strange. As Carlos settled the boy into the passenger seat, he glanced into the rearview mirror and saw the child's reflection empty, the seatbelt across nothing.
Carlos didn't recall describing this to many people. It made him feel ridiculous when he tried. But because he was a practical man, he put the boy down at the next rest stop where truckers and late travelers congregated, the sort of place that keeps coffee warm for people who can't afford the wait. The boy sat at a table and wouldn't eat. Carlos kept an eye on him because the kid was quiet and brittle. Then, while Carlos refilled his thermos, the boy walked outside and ran straight across the road. He vanished between 2 headlights like someone slipping off a stage when the curtains close. Later, a neighbor at the stop told Carlos about a small memorial at the side of that stretch, a cluster of toys and candles and a little girl's dress tied to a fence. The memorial memorialized a child who had been struck by a passing vehicle months, maybe years before. The dates were foggy in Carlos's memory.
The place matched, and for a while he couldn't shake the sense that the boy in the passenger seat had been asking for a ride home he could never reach. That's when these stories begin to gather traction. You get several of them, all similar. A child who appears, a rest stop that holds a memorial, a family who carries the memory like a wound. That pattern unsettles practical people because it's not convenient to dismiss. Either you accept something you can't prove, or you live with the residual fear at the edges of your life. As the night thickens, the line between a rational interpretation and a spectral one gets harder to draw. Some of these accounts resolve into human explanations. A man standing in shadow who's simply homeless. A child playing hide-and-seek who runs into the path of traffic. A trick of light. Others retain an element of the uncanny because they are, at their core, stories told by people who had no reason to invent the moment and still can't explain why a thing happened the way it did. We're not done. The rest of the collection moves toward a tight, tension-bearing dice, the hours that make drivers change their behavior and make certain roads feel like they'd rather not be remembered. There is a window of time, between 3 and 4 in the morning, that crawls through these accounts like a thin, cold hand. For some, it is simply the most dangerous amount of night when fatigue and alcohol and sleep deprivation are at their worst. For others, it's a threshold of something older, an hour when the world lets down its guard and strange things creep closer to the road. Later tonight, we'll hear the story that anchors this motif: a toll booth, a woman dragging her feet, a child in the lane, and a father who refused to stop between 3 and 4. But that one deserves the quiet and attention it makes itself demand, and we need to give the other voices room. For now, think of the road as a place where the ordinary and the uncanny cross paths.
Think of the shape of an old man's coat in low light, the echo of a child's footsteps swallowed by a rain-slicked shoulder, a photographer's empty footprints in a desert that negates presence. These images will swell as the night wears on, and the highway becomes less a conduit for travel than a stage where memory performs itself. There's a neighborhood of stories I haven't told yet. A woman at a rest stop who wore a sweater and a long skirt and dragged her feet as if she had no heels. A phantom hitchhiker who requests the same drop-off every time and never shows up at the destination. Long-haul drivers who wake to find a horse tied to their trailer with no owner in sight. Each one walks a line between the nightmare and the plausible, between a cautionary tale and an unsolved visit. I'll end this segment where the desert swallows proof, not because I doubt its reality, but because some silences are the loudest things we can carry with us. Mike drove on. He slept poorly. He kept his camera on the passenger seat like a talisman. Carlos kept driving too, but his nights felt like thin glass, one wrong sound away from splintering into something owed to the dark. Anna and her husband keep the longer route now, and the Beto family keeps telling each new driver the same words about paying attention. Stories accumulate, and sometimes accumulation is the closest thing we have to evidence. If you're alone in a car right now, if the highway hums beneath you and the dash clock moves into hours most people never see, that's by design. The road has its own hourglass. Keep your eyes open and keep an ear for the small noises that signal more than they should. Later, we'll go deeper into the rule people pass down like a worn coin, the one about never stopping between 3 and 4 in the morning. We'll meet the narrator's father, a man who learned that rule the way you learn not to touch a hot pan, and the night he taught his son to obey it. But first, we'll go back to the desert outpost, to Mike's boots in the sand. He told me in the last voice note before he stopped answering my messages for a week that he had driven back once more the next afternoon, the sun laying everything flat and merciless. He expected to see the scrap of the porch where someone had sat, a cigarette butt, a cup. He found only a blown wrapper and the usual signs of a place that hadn't been lived in for years: rust, bird droppings, a leaning sign. He said, either my mind made a story or I heard two people. The land takes the proof either way. Then he added something that made my own skin crawl. Something else, or someone else, might not like to be found out. I don't know yet what that means. I have Mike's photos, which show long exposures of empty roads and an outpost like an island of shadow and daylight, but no sign of the two voices. The images are beautiful in the way empty things are beautiful. They're also unhelpful, like bones without labels.
When we come back, I'll pick up Mike's trail and follow Carlos past the memorial and Beto's nephew into a truck stop where people swap warnings like currency. We'll travel to a toll booth that remembers a woman who asked to be let inside a cab and a boy who appeared in the headlights in a way that made a father decide to break a habit of mercy with a rule carved from fear. For now, keep your hands on the wheel. The road has more stories to tell. When we come back to Mike's trail, there are the usual dead ends. Unanswered calls, a voicemail that cuts off mid-sentence, a friend who promises to check on him and then stops answering too. I pressed him on the phone until he either hung up or the signal dropped, and in the last message he left me, he sounded thin, like someone who had been breathing too fast for too long. He said he had driven back to the outpost in daylight and found nothing but a wrapper and rust. The sand takes the proof, he told me, and then, quieter, I don't like the feeling that I was looked at. I kept looking anyway. I went over his photos frame by frame.
long exposures that made the highway look like a vein of light across a black desert, a shed that could be a stage prop, the lean-to a gray wedge against sky. There were no figures, there were horizons of nothing. The images were beautiful and empty, the kind of emptiness that makes you suspect there was room for something else to be hiding. Friends of Mike's offered the reasonable options: heat exhaustion, a prank, the mind's tendency to invent company when it gets lonely. All of that is true, and all of that is possible. But even those friends admitted, when they were honest and not trying to fix the unease with an explanation, that the desert has a way of erasing the proof of things that have happened within it. Wind smooths the sand, light melts the shape of footprints. Memory does not always cooperate with the facts we could hold in our hands. For Mike, that eraser felt like a slight, as if the place itself refused to be scrutinized. Where Mike's story ends in the long, uncertain space of the desert, other roads narrow into certainty of a different kind, the certainty of rules. Truck stops are full of them. The drivers trade them the way other people trade recipes or sports scores. Don't stop at that bridge. Don't pick up kids at 3 in the morning. If someone asks to be let into the cab, don't do it. They're rules built from experience. They're small rituals that multiply the chances of getting home. I sat in a truck stop just outside Mazatlan once, leaning over a thermos while the heater hummed in the background and the coffee machine clanged like a distant machine. Beto's nephew was there, the same voice who told me the old man's story. He roped in other drivers as the night went soft at the edges.
When truck drivers start telling stories to each other, they don't do it for drama. They do it to remember and to pass on instructions without making them sound fearful. One man told me, almost in the same breath as a hand reaching for sugar, about an evening at a rest stop 3 years back. He pulled up his shirt to show me a pale circle under his ribs, a bruise gone to a memory. He'd been brushing his teeth with a travel bottle when a woman in a heavy sweater and a long skirt shuffled towards his truck. The hem of the skirt scraped the asphalt. The fabric dragged like something that had been wet and wanted to be dry. She didn't meet his eyes at first. She lifted her hand in a small, awkward wave, like a person practicing politeness in a language they'd forgotten. When he rolled the window down an inch, she pressed her lips together, head cocked, and mouthed something the man couldn't read for a second. Then, clear as day, he felt the voice in the air. "Open me?" the man said he heard her say, though the word came shaped like a question. He considered the options: let her in and risk an unknown passenger in the dead of night, close the window and risk offending another human being, watch her and wonder if she belongs to a family nearby or if she was lost. He decided to keep the window down only a sliver, enough that she could not climb in, and said he could not help. She sighed as if tired of the word itself, the sound of someone who'd been practicing disappointment for a long time, and then she shuffled away, dragging that skirt behind her like a slow echo of movement. A week later, he learned that another driver had picked someone like that up on a different night and had been robbed a short distance down the road. The details were messy, people forget them or embellish them, but the lesson tightened itself. At a truck stop, a face that seems in need can be a person in need. It can also be a lure. The balance is an old one: mercy against survival. Drivers learn to calibrate. Many of the people who told me these things refused to agree on a single explanation. Some insisted it was local folk, a woman who had mental illness who wandered near the highway. Some said that certain stretches of road attracted a certain look of person. The highway collects sorrow and flings it back out occasionally. Others were quieter. They said they'd been tested, that the road had offered them a thing in the dark and taken it back again. Those men smelled like the diesel and the coffee in that room. They had seen things they would not put into a headline, but that had shaped the way they drove. That is the corridor where my own story sits. It is the one that tightened into a rule so deep in my house that it was carved into how we crossed the country. I was 14 the night my father taught me what to do when something in the dark asks you to stop. We were moving between towns with only the essentials packed.
The boxes in the back of the pickup clinked against each other. It was after midnight and before dawn, the kind of time that makes the radio sound like a thin ribbon of static. My father was a steady driver, deliberate with his hands, someone who measured the world in miles and rationed time and coffee and pit stops. He had been on the road most of his life and had a few rules he repeated like prayers. Keep your tires checked. Don't flash your lights at a semi. If anything looks wrong, don't stop between 3 and 4. At the time, it sounded like superstition, like something older men said to make their sons careful. Later, it would feel like a prison made of mercy. We hit the toll plaza about 2:45. There was a single booth lit by a strip light that hummed low, casting a pool of harsh white. My father eased up and rolled down the window. Ahead, a woman stood beside the plaza, wrapped in a sweater that hung heavy, and a long skirt that dragged and left a faint, dirty wake on the concrete. She leaned against the barrier as if it were the only place that would hold her upright. She did not walk toward other cars. She walked the line between lanes, the way some people pace the edge of sleep and wake in the same place. She looked at us when we stopped, and I saw her mouth move. The words were not audible at first, but when my father turned his head to listen, I could read her lips, because I had leaned forward like a child eavesdropping. "Open the door," she mouthed. "Open the door." My father's hands tightened on the wheel. I remember the small movement, a soft, almost invisible shake in his jaw as he decided. He did not roll the window down further. He did not reach for the latch. He said something under his breath about the hours and the stories he'd been told, and then he gunned the engine a little, and we slid past. The woman's hand went up a fraction, and for a second I could swear she lifted it like an invitation. After that, my father kept his head bent forward, not looking in the rearview mirror, until the toll booth stalled behind like teeth closing. We drove on, the radio a little louder. 3 lanes of highway, a few trucks in the distance, and the hum of the road. 10 miles down, maybe 15, there was a small figure in the lane ahead, a child's outline lit by the headlights. He was a tiny silhouette in the middle of the highway, motionless at first, and then running toward us with the terrible speed of someone who has nowhere else to go. My father did the hardest thing I'd ever seen him do. He did not stop. He swore later he could feel the boy when he passed him, a pressure like the warm breath against the window. It squeezed him in a way that made him grateful for the line between the seat and the steering wheel. He kept his foot on the pedal and threaded the truck between lanes as carefully as if we were sliding a needle through a seam. Close, practiced, unwilling to fold under the force of whatever was asking for help.
The boy dashed alongside the cab, then leaped up and caught the back of our truck for a moment, as if to hitch a ride. Then he was gone. When my father checked the mirror a moment later, there was no sign of him on the shoulder. Nothing on the broken grass. No light at the edge of the overpass where a person might have slipped. My father's face was ashen for days. He would not explain it in anything but the sharpest phrases. "You don't stop between 3 and 4, he told me when I asked him why. He said it with a fact, like gravity. It's the hour people are thin. It's the hour where the road is more likely to hand you a problem you can't solve." He repeated it until I could recite it without thinking, like a counterspell. People offered suggestions, rational ones, to explain what we'd seen. Maybe someone had put a mannequin out to trick drivers, and someone else added a child to the setup. Maybe the boy had been playing and darted into traffic, because children sometimes do dumb things for a laugh. Maybe our eyes had been tired. But then I remember how even rational explanations did not fit the physical sense of being touched by presence. That cold draft, the sound the boy's shoes made on wet asphalt, the muffled thud against the truck's rear that wasn't quite sound and wasn't quite absence. My father felt it, and when a man feels something at the wheel enough to carve a rule from it, that rule becomes a kind of map. The rule worked for us. We avoided certain lanes at certain hours. We took detours that made trips longer and more expensive. We would not pick up hitchhikers who looked even like they might be asking for a lift. If someone flagged us down in the purple hours, we slowed and passed on. You learn to be careful when the road seems to be testing you. Years later, when I sat down to collect these stories, I realized how many people had the same rule. Don't stop between 3 and 4. It surfaces again and again. Drivers toss it out like a talisman. No one seems sure of why that hour is meaningful, beyond the principle that it is when the world is weakest. But the consistency is itself a kind of data. People inherit rules because someone who's lived longer had a dread they wanted to protect their children from. Whether the dread is supernatural or just a human reckoning with how things go wrong at night, the behavior it produces remains survival. Even so, there are nights when rules make the thing sharper because you have to choose which one to follow. That toll booth woman, the sweater-skulking figure, continued to show up in other accounts. Some drivers swore they had seen her at rest stops or along rural pay booths, always the same motion, the same long skirt dragging. She didn't always speak the same words. Sometimes she begged. Sometimes she paced and nodded, as if saying the place where she needed to be was within reach, and no one offered it. Sometimes drivers said she was a grief, a projection, a homeless woman.
Other times their voices dropped and their hands tightened, and they used the same useful phrase, "She was not right." Those are the descriptions that have a way of changing a man who drives for a living. The highway insists on efficiency. It demands choices in split seconds. It punishes sentiment with accidents. Over time, the crew who haul freight learn that some acts of kindness can be the exact vector of danger. That hard calculus is what leads a man like my father to refuse a plea for help, even when a small voice says otherwise. There's another kind of testimony I heard in the hours after, once the late shift thinned and the truck stop chairs creaked like low bones as the room emptied. An old driver told me about a night he'd woken to the sound of horse hooves. He'd been sleeping in his cab on a stretch of road between towns, the kind of place that has a pull-off wide enough for a dozen trucks. He opened the door to check the trailer and half a lungful of night hit him, cold, smelling of wet leather and earth. A Spanish word that roughly translates to "it's not right" is the only thing he offered when I asked him to describe the scene. There, tethered to his trailer with a frayed rope, was a horse, soldier still, its coat dark with a slick he couldn't place. Its eyes were wide and wet. The driver asked it whose horse it was. There was no response. No one had left it. In the morning there was no track. No owner came back for it. It was a puzzle without edges. People tell that kind of story in the same way they tell about seeing an old man or a hooded woman. They don't demand belief. They offer it like a trade. You can take this detail and place it among your own reasons to be careful. I filed these away as well, letting them sit together until they made a shape I could name. The road keeps a ledger, and sometimes the ledger speaks. On some nights those voices don't ask you to open the door. They only make you notice the way the road curves or the way a particular bridge throws its shadow. On those nights the safest thing is to keep moving, to put distance between yourself and whatever memory might be lingering on the shoulder. That was my father's wisdom, and it saved us more than once. It also left me with the permanent sensation that the highway was a repository of people's last instants, and some of those instants were inclined to repeat themselves. The last element I want to bring up is the way grief becomes geography. Memorials beside the road, a teddy bear nailed to a post, a plastic cross, a string of candles melted into the shape of a small shrine, are the kinds of things that anchor the stories. Drivers find them and fold their memories around the objects like a warm scarf. I visited one such memorial when I followed Carlos's story more than a year after he described the boy with the dusty arm. The shrine sat under an overpass, a little collection of toys and faded photographs.
The headlights of my car picked out a plaque someone had left with a name and a date. It was a small thing. It made the air press close to my face. Carlos knelt and touched a toy truck with his fingers, like a man crossing himself. He was not a man of many words. He had seen a child who could not be kept in a seatbelt, and a roadside memorial that suggested that elsewhere the story had a hard end. For him, that sealed the feeling that the road sometimes replays certain motions for those who are still paying attention. Whether it is the echo of trauma returning again, or a ghost insisting on an answer, Carlos didn't try to settle it. He drove on, and the memory lodged in his bed of private rules, the same way a stone might lodge in the riverbed. There is one last thing I promised you back when we started, the idea that some people never came back. I've given you a trail of images that might be explained by prank, exhaustion, memory, or the subtle cruelty of the desert wind. I have also shown you hands that reached and voices that were heard, the hush that falls when someone who has lived on the road all their life repeats a caution like a cord around the neck of the night. I won't tell you which explanation is true. I will tell you this. These stories shaped behavior. They changed routes. They bent people's lives. Some listeners will hear these stories and file them under folklore. Some will let them seed a carefulness they did not have before. Some will think of my father and remember the night their own parent refused a plea, the time a rule saved them from what might have been. And some will drive home tonight thinking about the hours between 3 and 4, thinking of a woman mouthing, "Open me," and the boy who ran with the inhuman speed of someone refusing death or demanding it. A closing note, and then I'll leave you to the highway itself. I do have a request. If you've been on a road at the wrong hour and carried a memory you can't shake, send it in. The link is in the description. We collect these stories not to frighten, but to remember. We don't promise answers. We promise we will listen. Now, one last thought as you turn down the volume and check the mirrors. Drive roads with respect. Listen to the old rules and the new ones. If a place feels wrong, do not make a hero of your mercy. Sometimes the kindness you mean to show is the exact thing that becomes the vector of harm. Sometimes the road asks for a harder kind of love, the love that refuses to stop when the world is too thin to grant it mercy. We tell these tales because the highway holds them, and because the highway teaches.
They are the most chilling road stories ever told because they come from people who know the weight of the night on their shoulders. They are the most chilling because sometimes, at the end of a long stretch, no one ever came back.
If you have a road story you'd like us to hear, or you want to pick up the special edition collection of these tales, you'll find the link in the description. Share your city, your hour, the little fact you can't shake. We'll keep listening, and we'll keep passing the rules along.